Part 1. The evening started like any ordinary night at the small family restaurant that sat at the corner of a busy street. Warm lights glowed through the windows, and the sound of cutlery, soft chatter, and clinking glasses filled the room. People came here for simple comfort food, friendly service, and the cozy feeling that made it different from the big fancy places in the city. At a table near the center of the room sat a group of friends who had not seen each other in a long time. They had planned this gathering for weeks, hoping to catch up and laugh like they used to. Among them was Ian, quiet as always, with a gentle smile and eyes that drifted around the restaurant as if looking for something to calm his nerves. He wasn't the type who sought attention. In fact, he preferred blending into the background. When he spoke, he did so softly and only when someone asked him something directly. Even though everyone liked him, they often forgot how talented or thoughtful he truly was. He simply never put those things on display. The group chatted loudly about work, families, upcoming plans, and old memories. They joked about silly things they did in school, teased each other playfully, and shared updates about their lives. Ian listened mostly, occasionally adding a small laugh or a short response. He enjoyed being around them, but he always felt more comfortable watching than talking. On the far side of the restaurant stood an old upright piano. Its wooden surface had scratches and faded edges that showed years of use. Some customers loved tapping its keys while waiting for their food, even if all they played were simple tunes. The owner allowed it because it added a homely feel to the place. One of the friends noticed the piano and nudged the person next to him. "Hey, isn't Ian the one who used to play a little?" Before Ian could say anything, someone else laughed. "Yeah, he used to play all those easy songs. Come on, Ian, go play something simple." Ian's head lifted slightly, a bit surprised that they remembered that part of his life. He shook his head with a small smile and replied softly, No, it's been years. I barely remember anything." His friends didn't stop. They kept pushing, but in a friendly way, not realizing they were putting him in a tough spot. "Just one simple tune," someone insisted. "Nothing big. Just play something short." "Yeah, we want to hear something. Anything. Even if it's one of those basic songs." Ian lowered his eyes again. His fingers, resting on the table, twitched slightly, as if they remembered something he didn't want to think about. Playing the piano was not just a skill for him. It carried memories he rarely talked about, memories he wasn't sure he wanted to bring back. Still, the teasing grew louder, and he felt cornered. They didn't mean to bother him, that much he knew, but it didn't make the pressure any lighter. He tried to brush it off. "I really don't think." But his friend cut him off with a grin. "Oh, come on. What's the worst that could happen? You play a simple song, we clap, we eat, the night goes on." Someone else added, "If you don't go, we'll keep bothering you until you do." Ian finally sighed quietly. He didn't want to ruin the mood or come across as stubborn. These were his friends, after all, and they were all here to enjoy the night. Maybe playing a little something, just a small tune, would make them happy and stop the teasing. "Fine," he said gently. "Just one quick thing. Then no more asking." The group cheered as if he had agreed to perform at a concert. Ian smiled awkwardly, almost embarrassed by the sudden attention. He stood up slowly, straightened his shirt, and tried to push away the nervousness growing inside him. As he walked toward the piano, his steps were steady but hesitant. He didn't walk with the confidence of someone excited to perform. He walked like someone stepping into a space he hadn't entered in years, familiar, yet far away. The restaurant was still full of noise. People talked, laughed, and continued eating, paying little attention to him. No one expected anything special. Most didn't even notice he was heading to the piano. It made him feel both relieved and unsure. When he reached the old piano, he paused for a moment and looked at it closely. It had dust in the corners and scratches from years of being played by different hands. But it also had a warmth, a feeling that it had been part of many stories. Ian slowly pulled the wooden bench back and sat down. His friends watched from their table, smiling and whispering among themselves, joking about which easy song he might play. He placed his fingers gently on the keys, pressing one softly to test its sound. The note rang out a little brighter than he expected, filling the air for a brief second. His breath grew slower. His eyes softened. For a moment, he wasn't in the restaurant anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere from long ago. His friends watched him with light amusement, thinking he might accidentally play a wrong note or struggle to remember a basic song. They had no idea what was happening inside him. Ian wasn't just touching a piano. He was touching a part of his life he had closed the door on for years. He remembered being younger, sitting beside someone who encouraged him, someone who told him that music could speak when words couldn't. He remembered playing melodies that made him feel free and alive. He remembered practicing late at night just to perfect one small section. He remembered joy and loss. All those memories moved quietly through him as he rested his hands on the keys. He could feel the weight of the past, but he could also feel a tiny spark inside, the same spark he once felt before performing a piece he loved. A part of him wanted to turn away, to stand up and walk back to the table, to avoid letting these memories spill into the present. But another part of him, the part he thought had faded, wanted to play, not because his friends asked him to, but because his heart had something to say. He breathed in deeply, gently straightened his back, and adjusted his hands. His friends waited. The restaurant carried on around him, unaware of the moment building quietly at the piano. He pressed the first key. Just one note. Soft. Clear. The note drifted through the room, untouched by the noise, as if it had a life of its own. Ian felt something shift inside him. He was supposed to play something simple, but the moment his finger touched the key, he knew something completely different was about to happen. Part 2. The single note Ian played lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. It was soft, gentle, and almost too delicate to draw attention in a busy place like that. But something about it held a quiet kind of weight, like the beginning of a thought that wanted to grow into something deeper. Ian sat still for a moment, letting his finger rest on the key. His friends waited impatiently from their table, expecting him to mess around or play a few random sounds before giving up. To them, this was all just a harmless joke, a bit of lighthearted teasing. But to Ian, the moment felt strangely heavy. His heart was beating a little faster than usual. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more complicated, something he hadn't felt in years. He lifted his hand again and pressed another key. Then another. The gentle notes formed a small pattern, not something anyone would recognize, but something that felt familiar only to him. As he continued, the soft chatter in the restaurant didn't stop yet. People were too busy in their conversations to notice one young man sitting at an old piano. Most of them didn't even look in his direction. Yet the notes carried a kind of honesty that slowly began to thread its way through the space. Ian leaned slightly forward, the subtle motion of someone beginning to settle into a place they didn't expect to be. His hands moved again, playing another sequence. Still quiet, still simple in appearance, but shaped with care. Across the room, a couple seated near the window paused mid-conversation. They glanced toward the piano, their faces softening with curiosity. They couldn't quite place what the tune was, but it didn't sound like the kind of melody someone played jokingly. Ian didn't notice them. His eyes were half lowered, focused on the keys but not really seeing them. His mind wandered somewhere between the present and the past. The feeling of touching the piano again felt strange, almost like rediscovering a forgotten language. His fingers found a new rhythm, something a little more emotional, a little more connected. It wasn't loud, nor was it complicated, but it carried a warmth that began to change the air in the room. At his table, his friends shared amused glances. "Looks like he remembers something," one whispered, grinning. "Probably one of those easy songs from school," another replied. They didn't understand what was happening. They couldn't hear the quiet shift taking place inside the sound he was creating. Ian continued to play, and each note felt like a step deeper into himself. Memories moved softly in his mind, images of late evenings practicing, the soft guidance of someone he cared for, the excitement of learning something new. These memories were distant, but the piano had a way of bringing them back in pieces. The melody began to grow, not louder but fuller, more thoughtful. The nearby couple leaned in, listening more carefully now. A waiter walking past slowed his steps, trying to catch the tune. Something about it made him pause for just a second before he continued toward the kitchen. The restaurant still buzzed with noise, but small pockets of silence began to appear. People who noticed the music stopped speaking for a moment, turning their heads slightly without even realizing they were doing it. Ian's fingers moved with more confidence. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone or showing a hidden talent. He wasn't even thinking about the people around him. The music felt like something alive, something speaking for him in ways he couldn't use words. He played a short rise in the melody, soft at first, then warmer, and the sound floated gently through the room. The friends who had teased him earlier leaned back in their chairs, suddenly less amused and more surprised. "Wait," one of them whispered. "That doesn't sound simple." Another nodded slowly. "I didn't know he could play like that." Their laughter faded. They watched him more seriously now, beginning to sense something they hadn't expected. Ian didn't look at them. His face carried a calm focus. Something soft, something thoughtful. His hands moved with a natural ease he hadn't shown in years. He looked almost like someone returning home to a place they'd forgotten existed. The quiet parts of the melody blended with gentle shifts, like waves rising and falling. It wasn't a dramatic performance, but it carried emotion. Real, honest emotion that slowly spread across the room. Another group at a nearby table stopped talking altogether. One woman whispered, "Who's playing?" Her friend shook her head. "I don't know, but it sounds beautiful." Still, the restaurant owner was the only one who noticed the gradual shift in the room's energy. He stood behind the counter watching Ian carefully, his eyebrows raised in surprise. He had heard many customers tap random keys on that old piano, and most people did it for fun or to joke around. But this sound was different. It held feeling. The owner leaned against the counter, observing the young man whose fingers danced softly across the keys. Ian's posture grew more relaxed, as though the piano was reminding him how natural this once felt. Each note landed with intention, gentle, steady, expressive. His mind drifted into thoughts he didn't mean to revisit. He remembered evenings long ago when he used to play for someone who encouraged him, someone who believed in him more than he believed in himself. That person would sit beside him, smiling proudly every time he learned something new. When that person was gone, the piano felt heavy, almost painful to touch. So he stopped. He didn't quit because he lost interest. He quit because the music reminded him of what he missed. But now, sitting here after so many years, the memories didn't hurt the same way. They felt softer, like a photograph that had faded at the edges. He played another series of notes, gentle but full, like tiny pieces of emotion escaping without his permission. From the corner of the room, the couple near the window shared a shocked glance. "This is really good," the man whispered. "It feels emotional," the woman added quietly. More diners began noticing. Conversations softened. Some turned in their seats. The restaurant didn't fall silent yet, but there was a noticeable shift. People sensed something happening, even if they didn't know what. Ian lifted his hands for a moment, letting a soft pause fill the room. His heart beat steadily, not fast, not slow, just steady. His breathing deepened. He could feel the room around him, but it didn't distract him. Instead, the energy of the place began to connect with the melody flowing from his fingertips. He continued playing, this time shaping the melody into something slightly richer. The notes blended into each other like soft threads woven into a single piece of cloth. His fingers moved carefully, as though each note was chosen with emotion rather than skill. A woman at another table whispered to her partner, "You hear that?" He nodded. "Yeah. That's not something simple." The owner stepped forward from behind the counter, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Ian as if witnessing something rare. Back at his own table, Ian's friends finally stopped whispering. Their playful grins had disappeared, replaced by growing astonishment. They had asked him to play something simple. This wasn't simple at all. Ian didn't push the melody louder, but he let it grow deeper, more heartfelt. Each note felt like it carried a little story, a little feeling that someone could sense even without understanding music. The atmosphere in the room shifted even further. More heads turned. More voices quieted. Someone from the back said softly, "Who is he?" Another replied, "I don't know. But that sounds like a real musician." Ian still didn't look up. If he saw the room's reaction, he might have stopped. Instead, he let the music guide him, feeling every motion, every sound, every small rise and fall in the melody. It wasn't a performance. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply feeling. And without meaning to, he let the entire room feel it with him. The simple tune his friends expected had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful. Something that none of them saw coming. Something that was only just beginning to unfold. Part 3. The melody Ian played began to settle into the room like a soft blanket, gently wrapping itself around every table, every chair, every person sitting inside the restaurant. What started as a quiet sound now carried a presence strong enough to draw people in without force, without showiness, without effort. It felt honest, the kind of music that didn't need to be loud to be heard. More diners lifted their heads and turned toward the piano. Some did it slowly, as if the music had touched their attention without asking permission. Others turned more sharply, surprised that something so gentle could catch their ears so easily. Ian continued to play, unaware of the change happening around him. His fingers moved with natural ease, tracing the keys like they knew exactly where to go even after years of silence. The old piano responded to him, its worn-out keys producing a warm, slightly imperfect sound that only added to the emotion in the melody. A waiter carrying a tray stopped halfway to a table, listening for a moment before moving again. Another waiter stepped out of the kitchen, pausing by the door with his head tilted slightly. The restaurant owner crossed his arms and leaned against a wall, nodding lightly as he listened. He wasn't a musician, but he didn't need to be to recognize that what was happening was something special. The lights above the dining area cast a gentle glow across the room, making the atmosphere feel intimate, as though everyone had unknowingly become part of a shared moment. Back at the friends' table, silence had replaced the earlier teasing. They watched Ian with a mixture of shock and confusion. It was like seeing someone they thought they knew suddenly open a hidden door to a part of themselves they never revealed. One of them whispered, "I didn't know he could play like this." Another shook his head. "I don't think any of us did." They looked at each other, unsure how to react. They had expected to laugh, maybe clap a little out of politeness, then move on. Instead, they found themselves speechless. The melody continued to grow, not louder, but deeper, richer. Each note carried emotion that even Ian didn't realize he was releasing. It was as though the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a doorway into memories he kept buried. He pictured himself years ago, sitting in a small living room, practicing the same melody for someone who always listened patiently. He remembered the encouragement, the warmth, the soft voice telling him that music could be a friend when he felt alone. He remembered the happiness of those moments. He also remembered the silence that followed after that person was gone. Music had become painful after that. It reminded him of what he lost, of the absence that echoed louder than any note he could play. So he stopped. He closed the piano at home and never opened it again. But now, in this small restaurant with strangers watching without knowing why the melody felt so heavy, Ian felt something shift inside him. The memories returned, but they didn't feel like they used to. They didn't hurt in the same sharp way. Instead, they felt soft, like gentle reminders of a time that shaped him. The music he played now wasn't sad. It wasn't cheerful either. It was somewhere in between, a balance of longing and peace, of remembering and letting go. A drop in the melody created a moment of stillness. The note lingered, then dissolved into a rise that felt almost hopeful. People listening didn't need to understand music to feel its emotion. A young girl sitting with her parents turned her head toward the piano, her face lighting up in wonder. "It sounds so pretty," she whispered. Her mother smiled softly. "Yes, it does." On the opposite side of the room, a man eating alone set down his fork and crossed his arms on the table, watching with quiet appreciation. The music made him For a moment, the long day he had just endured. Near the entrance, a couple holding hands slowed their conversation until they eventually fell silent, both focused on the sound coming from the piano. Still, Ian kept playing, unaware of how many eyes were on him now. He wasn't performing for them. He was letting himself return to a place he thought he could never visit again. His fingers glided across the keys with a soft confidence. His posture was relaxed, not stiff or nervous. He moved almost like someone who belonged there, as though the piano had been waiting for him all this time. The melody shifted into a gentle sweep of notes that felt like a sigh, like someone finally letting out a breath they had been holding in for too long. It gave the room an emotional warmth that people responded to even if they didn't fully understand why. More chairs turned. More conversations faded. The restaurant wasn't silent, but it was quieter, calm, attentive, and connected. A waiter walked over to the owner and whispered, "He's really good." The owner nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Ian. "Yes, I didn't expect this." Back at the table, one of the friends leaned forward with their elbows on the table, whispering, "We shouldn't have pushed him." Another replied, "I don't think we understood what we were asking." The group fell silent again, watching the friend they had underestimated. They felt guilty but also proud. They weren't sure which emotion was stronger. Meanwhile, Ian's hands moved gently but purposefully, shaping the melody into a soft climb. The notes intertwined beautifully, rising just enough to touch the corners of the restaurant before falling again in delicate waves. It felt like hearing someone speak without words, someone who had things locked inside their heart for years. The piano made a slightly uneven sound here and there, the result of old keys that weren't perfectly tuned. But instead of taking away from the music, it added character, like cracks in a painting that made it real. One older man near the back wiped his eyes quietly, not out of sadness but because the music reminded him of a time long past, distant, warm, and deeply personal. Ian, still unaware of the room's focus, allowed the melody to soften again. His fingers brushed lightly over the keys, creating small ripples of sound that felt like whispers. The candle flames on the tables flickered slightly, as if reacting to the gentle waves of music. A few people held their breath without realizing it. The melody dipped into something quiet and thoughtful. It wasn't heavy, but it carried meaning. People could sense that the young man at the piano wasn't playing randomly. He was expressing something. A final rise in the melody began to form. It wasn't the end, but it felt like a shift, as though the music was entering a new chapter. The owner stepped a little closer. The waiters paused again. The room held onto the sound. Ian closed his eyes for a moment, letting his fingers guide him rather than his thoughts. And then it happened. The room changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but noticeably. Conversations fell silent. Forks and spoons stopped mid-air. People who had been half listening were now fully listening. It was as if the entire room took a single, collective breath. Ian didn't see it. He didn't know they were all watching him now. Every table, every corner, every diner who had walked in expecting nothing unusual from their evening. But the melody had reached them. It had reached everyone. A soft, innocent tune that began as a simple request had transformed the atmosphere. And in that moment, without lifting his eyes from the keys, without meaning to, Ian had captured the entire room. Not with volume, not with force, but with emotion. Pure, gentle emotion that made the whole restaurant fall silent and listen. What happened next would surprise even him. Part 4. The quiet shift in the restaurant felt almost unreal. One moment the room had been full of chatter, clinking plates, and everyday noise. The next, it was as though someone had gently lowered a soft curtain over everything, leaving only the sound of the piano floating through the space. Ian still didn't know that the entire room had fallen silent. His eyes were lowered, focused only on the keys and the movement of his own hands. He wasn't thinking about playing well or impressing anyone. He wasn't thinking about the people watching him. He wasn't even thinking about the restaurant. He was simply thinking about the music. The melody had grown into something unexpectedly emotional, touching a place inside him he hadn't opened in years. It was a strange feeling, comforting yet vulnerable. He felt as if every note was tied to a memory, and every memory was tied to a piece of his heart he had tried to hide. His fingers moved gently, shaping the sound into soft waves. The music rose and fell like a conversation whispered between old friends. Across the room, no one wanted to interrupt. The silence wasn't forced. It was natural, created by the weight and warmth of the music itself. A young boy sitting with his family leaned his head on his mother's arm and whispered, "It sounds like the music they play in movies." His mother smiled and stroked his hair. "Yes, it does." An older couple held hands under their table, listening with peaceful expressions. A pair of friends who had been arguing quietly earlier now sat still, their disagreement forgotten. Even the kitchen staff, normally busy and loud, peeked through the small window above the counter, listening with wide eyes. The restaurant owner, standing closer than before, placed a hand over his stomach and took a deep breath. He hadn't expected anything like this when he allowed customers to use the old piano. Usually, someone would come and play a few notes, laugh and walk away. But tonight felt different. "Who is he?" A whisper rose from a nearby table. "I don't know," someone beside them answered softly. "But he's playing with his heart." The owner nodded without turning around. That was exactly what it sounded like. Back at the friends' table, the group sat frozen, eyes glued to Ian. The person who had teased him the most earlier now had a heavy feeling in their chest. "We shouldn't have made him do it like that," one whispered, but another shook their head. "Look at him, he's not playing because of us now. He's playing because he wants to." Their voices faded again, replaced by awe and a growing respect. The melody shifted once more. It softened into something delicate, fragile even, like a tiny echo of emotion trying to find its place in the air. Ian's fingers hovered for a moment before pressing another series of notes that sounded almost like a response to a question. The room felt them, every single person. The quiet tune began to grow, just a little. Not loudly, but warmly, like a gentle sunrise after a long night. The notes blended together, forming a calm rhythm that carried hope. Ian's breathing deepened. His shoulders lowered. A small, almost unnoticeable expression softened his face. He was letting go of fear, of hesitation, of the weight he had carried whenever he thought about music. He remembered again the person who taught him to love the piano. He remembered being encouraged to express himself, to trust the sound inside him. He remembered the pride in their voice, the kindness in their touch, the joy they felt each time he mastered something new. For a long time after losing them, music had felt like a sharp reminder of pain. But tonight, the piano felt different. It felt like a connection, not to sadness, but to gratitude. His fingers danced gently over the keys, creating a melody that felt like a conversation between the past and the present. People in the room didn't know the story behind his music, but they could feel the emotion in it. They could sense that this quiet performance wasn't just about playing a tune. It was about releasing something deep. A woman quietly wiped the corner of her eye. A man sitting across from her whispered, "It reminds me of my childhood." "Me too," she whispered back. The music carried memory for many people, even if they didn't know why. Near the back, someone pulled out their phone to record, but the owner gently shook his head and whispered, "Let him be." The person hesitated, then nodded and lowered the phone. This wasn't a moment to capture on a screen. It was a moment to feel. Ian let his fingers move into a slightly higher pattern now, a soft rise that made the room lift with him. The sound was hopeful but still grounded in emotion. He finally took a slow breath and opened his eyes, not fully, just enough to see the keys more clearly. And then he noticed something. The room was quiet, completely quiet. Ian's fingers paused for half a second. His heart skipped. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected anyone to really listen. He looked up for the first time since he started playing. Every table, every seat, every person, all eyes were on him. His breath caught in his throat. His hands almost froze. He had imagined people laughing, talking, or ignoring him. He expected his friends to tease him more. He expected to finish a simple tune and walk back to his seat with an awkward smile. He never expected this. The silence wasn't cold or uncomfortable. It was warm. It was full. It was the kind of silence created when people are holding on to a moment they don't want to disturb. Ian felt his chest tighten. Not with fear, but with something tender. He swallowed softly, his lips parting from the gentle shock. A waiter near the counter offered him a small, encouraging nod. The older couple by the window smiled warmly. The group of friends who had pushed him to play sat frozen, almost embarrassed by how much they underestimated him. And the owner, he simply watched with a soft, proud expression. Ian turned back to the keys. His hands shook lightly, but only for a moment. He had a choice now. Stop playing because the attention scared him, or keep playing because the music meant something. He lowered his hands again, and he chose to continue. But this time the melody changed. It grew warmer, richer, like he was no longer playing alone, but with the energy of the room supporting him. The notes flowed with newfound courage. The tune rose gently, brighter than before, like opening a window after a long time and letting sunlight touch a room that had been closed for years. People leaned forward unconsciously, drawn deeper into the sound. Ian felt his heart open a little more. He wasn't afraid now. The silence in the room no longer startled him. It comforted him. It made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt seen. Not judged. Not teased. Just seen. His fingers moved with grace, carrying a message he didn't know how to say. The melody grew more expressive, like a soft confession. Gentle, emotional, honest. For the first time in many years, he felt connected to the music again. Truly connected. He didn't know that the room was about to respond. He didn't know that something even more surprising was about to happen. But when he finished one soft phrase and allowed a brief pause, a sound rose from the back of the restaurant. Not a whisper. Not a laugh. Not a clink of silverware. It was the beginning of applause. Quiet at first, then spreading table by table, like gentle rain. Ian's lips parted in disbelief. And in that small, warm restaurant, the night took a turn none of them would ever forget. Part 5, 1400 words. Simple English, human-centric, no headings, no disallowed names. The moment the hall fell silent after the last note, it felt as if time itself had paused. The room, which had been full of chatter only an hour earlier, now felt completely different. People were still sitting frozen in their seats, almost afraid to move. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from confusion. It was the kind that came from being completely overwhelmed. But while the audience was still recovering from the shock, he stood beside the piano with his hands slightly shaking. Not because he was afraid, but because he had never experienced something like that in his entire life. He had played music in small places before. He had even played in busy rooms where no one cared about him. But this was new. This was something he didn't expect. Not in the slightest. He kept glancing around the hall, unsure of what he was supposed to do next. Normally, after performing anywhere, he would quietly step back, pack his things, and leave before anyone could stop him. He didn't like attention. He didn't like being the center of anything. He liked music because it was safe, because it didn't judge him, and because it allowed him to speak without speaking. But today, people were staring at him like he had just done something unbelievable. Their mouths were open, their eyes were wide, and no one seemed ready to look away. Some were even wiping their eyes, trying to understand why the music had made them feel so much at once. He took a small breath and looked toward the side of the hall, where the event organizer stood. The organizer looked just as stunned as everyone else. He wasn't moving either. He wasn't signaling anything. He wasn't giving any instructions. He was simply frozen in place with both hands covering his mouth as if he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Finally, someone in the audience stood up. The sound of the chair moving broke the silence. Then another person stood. Then another. In just a few seconds, the entire hall rose to their feet at the same time. A wave of applause burst through the room. It wasn't polite applause or the kind given out of respect. It was loud and strong and full of excitement. People clapped with both hands raised. Some whistled. Some shouted words like, "Amazing," and unbelievable. And how did he do that? He felt warmth rise in his chest as the applause washed over him. Felt unreal. He had imagined moments like this when he was younger, but he had never actually believed they could happen. Not to him. Not in a room full of people who didn't even know his name. He stepped back from the piano slightly, unsure if he should bow or just smile. Before he could decide, a small group rushed toward the front. They weren't pushing or fighting. They were simply eager to get closer, as if they wanted to understand the person behind the music. One man leaned forward and said, "That wasn't simple at all. That was something else." Another person added, "You should be performing on big stages. Why are you not already doing that?" Someone else asked, "Where did you learn to play like that? Did you study somewhere?" He didn't know how to answer any of those questions. He had learned by listening, by practicing alone, by playing with broken keys on a piano that barely worked. He had never taken lessons. He had never gone to a music school. Everything he knew, he had taught himself quietly, piece by piece, without anyone noticing. But before he could say any of that, the organizer finally snapped out of his shock and hurried to the stage. His eyes were bright, and he was smiling so widely that it almost didn't look real. "That was incredible," the organizer said breathlessly. "You have no idea what you've just done." He opened his mouth to respond, but the organizer continued quickly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Do you know how many people come through here and try to impress this crowd? Do you know how many trained musicians? How many professionals? How many people who brag about their talents step on this stage?" He didn't respond. He just looked at the organizer and waited. "They try," the organizer said, "but they don't do what you just did." The organizer stepped back and gestured toward the crowd, who were still clapping and cheering. "You made them feel something. And trust me, that is far more rare than you think." He looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. He didn't know how to react to praise on this scale. Compliments had always made him uncomfortable. But this time, for some reason, the words didn't make him want to hide. Instead, they felt like something he wanted to hold on to for a long time. As the applause continued, the organizer suddenly turned to the crowd and raised one hand. The room slowly quieted, but the energy remained strong. The organizer said loudly, "Friends, I think we all agree we witnessed something special today." A wave of agreement spread through the hall, people nodding, murmuring, smiling. "And I think we deserve to hear another one," the organizer added with a playful grin. The crowd erupted into cheers again. He blinked in surprise. Another one? He hadn't prepared anything else. He hadn't even planned to play the first piece. He had been asked to play something simple, and he had only reacted to the moment. Playing again wasn't part of the plan. His mind raced. What would he play? Would it sound right? Would it be as good as the first one? Would they expect something even better? But when he looked up and saw the audience smiling at him, not pressuring him, not demanding, but simply excited, his worry softened. They weren't waiting for perfection. They were waiting to hear him again. He slowly approached the piano once more. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also more certain. He sat on the bench and let his fingers rest on the keys. The hall grew silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was warm, almost comforting. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. Then, without thinking too much, he began to play. This piece was softer than the first one. It had a calm rhythm, something gentle that floated like a lullaby. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was meant to soothe, to remind people of quiet nights and peaceful moments, to bring comfort. The room stayed still as the melody grew. Some closed their eyes. Some held hands. Some simply listened with soft smiles. And as he played, he realized something important. He wasn't performing for approval. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was sharing something real, something that came from his own life, his own feelings, his own way of seeing the world. When the final note faded, the audience didn't clap right away. It was the same kind of silence as before, deep, emotional, almost sacred. Then the applause began again, this time even warmer than before. He looked at the piano one last time, touched the keys gently, then stood up. The audience kept clapping, but he didn't feel overwhelmed anymore. Instead, he felt grateful. He didn't know what would happen next or how this moment would change his life. But he knew one thing for sure. Everything was different now, and part 6 was waiting to happen. Part 6, 1400 words. Simple English, human-centric, natural tone. No headings, no disallowed names. When the applause for the second piece finally faded, he stood there quietly, unsure what to do next. The night had turned into something far bigger than anything he had expected. He had come to the event thinking he would help out, maybe fix a few things backstage, and then leave like he always did. Playing the piano had not been part of his plan. Changing the entire atmosphere of the hall had not even crossed his mind. But now, people were gathering in small groups, talking about him, pointing toward the stage, and whispering with wide smiles. Some were already pulling out their phones, typing quickly, probably sharing the moment with friends or family. A few even tried recording him again, but the organizer politely reminded them that the stage area needed to stay clear for a moment. The organizer turned back to him and said softly, "You need a break. Come with me." He nodded and followed him to a quieter corner behind the curtains. The hallway was dimly lit and silent, a huge contrast to the energy he had just left behind. He sat on a small bench, still trying to process everything. "Are you all right?" the organizer asked. He nodded again, but his expression clearly showed that his mind was still racing. The organizer smiled lightly. "That was a lot, huh?" He let out a small breath. "I've never played in front of so many people. Not like that." "Well," the organizer said, leaning against the wall, "after tonight, you might have to get used to it." He blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" The organizer took out his phone and turned the screen toward him. It showed dozens of messages, notifications, and missed calls. "People out there are asking about you. They want your name. They want to know where you perform. They're asking if you have any recordings, any social media, anything." He swallowed hard. He had none of those things. He had always lived quietly, away from attention. I've never done anything like that," he said softly. The organizer sat beside him. "Listen, you have something rare, not just talent. Heart. When you play, people feel it. And that's not something you can teach. It's something you're born with." He looked down at his hands again. The same hands he used to fix broken chairs and carry equipment from room to room. The same hands that had cleaned floors and moved heavy boxes. They didn't look like the hands of a professional musician. They just looked normal. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this," he whispered. "You don't have to be ready," the organizer said gently. "But you do have to choose. Do you want to stay in the shadows forever? Or do you want to share what you have with the world?" The question lingered in the air. For years, he had been hiding without realizing it. He played music only for himself, only in quiet moments, only when no one was watching. It had always felt safer that way. But today, for the first time, he had stepped out of that safe space. And instead of being judged or rejected, he had been celebrated. The door behind them opened suddenly, and a woman entered, followed by 2 other guests. They looked excited and slightly out of breath. "There you are," she said. "We've been trying to find you." He stood up quickly, startled. The organizer gave him a reassuring nod. One of the guests stepped forward. "We just wanted to say your performance was unforgettable. We came all the way backstage just to tell you that." Another added, "I haven't felt something like that in years. You brought something to this event that none of us expected." He thanked them quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled warmly. "You need to continue this. You really do." After they left, more guests came by. Some stayed for only a moment, just wanting to shake his hand. Others asked gentle questions about his past, how he learned, how long he had been playing. He answered the simple ones and smiled politely whenever he didn't know what to say. Eventually, the organizer stepped in again, this time guiding him back toward the stage area. The event was ending, and people were slowly preparing to leave. But many stayed near the front, hoping to see him one more time before they went. He stepped onto the stage again, not to perform, but simply to thank the crowd. They applauded the moment they saw him. He raised a hand slightly, asking for quiet. When the room settled, he spoke with a soft voice. I didn't plan to play today, he began. I thought I was only helping out. But thank you for listening. And thank you for making this moment something I'll never forget. The audience responded not with loud cheers, but with warm, gentle applause. After the event finally wrapped up, the organizer approached him again. There's one more thing, the organizer said, handing him a small folder. Inside were 3 invitations, 3 different venues in the city asking him to perform. Not small places, important ones. His eyes widened. How did they even know? They were here tonight, the organizer said with a proud smile. And they saw what you can do. He ran his fingers slowly across the invitations. His life didn't usually change. His days were simple, predictable. He woke up, worked, played music alone, and went to sleep. That was it. But now, suddenly, he had choices he never imagined. Take your time, the organizer said. You don't have to decide now. He nodded quietly. Later that night, after everyone left, he found himself alone in the hall. The lights were dim, and the room had returned to its usual calm. The piano sat on the stage quietly, as if waiting for him. He walked up to it slowly and touched the keys with the tips of his fingers. He didn't play a full melody, just a few soft notes. They echoed gently in the empty room. He took a seat on the bench and looked at the keys again, remembering how the night had begun, with someone saying, "Play something simple." He let out a small, warm laugh. Nothing about what happened tonight had been simple, but it had been real. He began to play again, not for an audience, not for applause, but for himself, letting every thought, every feeling, every hope flow through the music. The melody was soft and slow, filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the chance he never expected. Gratitude for the people who believed in him. Gratitude for the courage he had somehow found. He played until the hall felt full again, not with people, but with the memory of them. When he finally closed the piano lid, he stood up and looked around the room one last time. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be a new beginning. But tonight, he walked out with a quiet certainty growing in his heart. He didn't know where the path would lead. He didn't know how far he would go. But he knew something he had never known before. He was meant to play, and the world was finally ready to listen.